you so much for coming out here today. There's nothing like one bad poll to get good results. And I know what I'm talking about. Back in 1996, I remember, I think it maybe did the same poll. I came out a few days before the race. It had me behind Governor Wells, big headlines in the Boston Herald. Kind of wondered whether there was a little collusion or something going on. And lo and behold, the real poll came back on Tuesday. It'll come back this Tuesday. I won that race, and Martha Copley's going to win this race. Now let's talk reality here for a couple of minutes. There's one thing that is clear to all of us. Yes, there is anger out there. There's anger out there in the country, and there's anger out there in Massachusetts. I feel it, I hear it, I've watched it building over these last couple of years. It's part of the reason that we elected Barack Obama. It's part of the reason we've been making these tough choices that we've had to make. It's justified anger. It's understandable anger. People have lost their jobs. Many people have had their life savings wiped away. People have seen homes taken out from under them in countless numbers across our nation. And there's a fear and an anxiety out there. But let me tell you, let's not forget where that anger ought to be directed. That anger ought to be directed, and this is the chance for people in Massachusetts to put it there, at the people and the principles and the policies and the party that threw out the regulators, that opened the floodgates of greed, that invited in the worst economic times in this country's history, and I believe turned its back on fairness and common sense on this country. This is the time where we can say to a party that since George Bush has left office has had nothing to say but no. No to everything. This is our chance to elect Martha Coakley and say yes to the future. From the moment that Barack Obama was elected president less than 1 year ago, because of that anger, and I think Bill Clinton will agree with me on this, that since that time, Barack Obama has had to make some of the toughest choices of any president of the United States since Franklin Roosevelt. All of us in Congress have had to spend this last year not throwing out slogans, not playing to the cheap seats, not just using the old time-worn slogans of politics, but actually governing, making decisions to bring this country back from the brink. How to stop jobs from hemorrhaging. How to save the banking system of our country. These are the decisions that we had to make, many of them unpopular decisions. But all of that time, through each and every single urgent choice and every single tough decision, the Republicans did nothing but say no. No alternatives to the disaster, just plain no. No to jobs. No to the bailout money that we had to keep people in their homes. No to the money that we wanted to put into immediate putting people back to work. No to health care. No to Medicare. No to extension of unemployment benefits for people who lost their jobs. No to strengthening Medicare itself. No to energy independence. In every case, no. They made a calculated political decision that they would say no to governments, create anger, and then let the anger fall on those who are struggling to make the choices in these tough decisions. And now, they have the gall to want to receive a bonus for doing it. But my friends, the only things the Republicans say yes to are Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Tea Partiers, you know, I was in the hospital that day having a small operation, so I got to see a lot of TV. Even please. And so I've seen all the ads, I've seen all the words. I've even seen Martha Copley compare himself to President Kennedy. Well, wait a minute. Now, are you surprised that he would try to compare himself to Kennedy rather than compare himself to George Bush? And when Martha Coakley tries to hold him accountable for Dick Cheney and George Bush, what does he say? He says, oh, that's an old joke. Or he says, oh, you're running against me, not Cheney and Bush. Well, it would be an old joke. If it were, it wouldn't be so dangerous, folks. But the fact is that you can measure where people are going to go by where they've been and by what they've done. And the fact is that over the course of these last 8 years, you just can't forget where we've been so quickly. This is an extraordinary sort of camouflage campaign that's taken place over these past weeks. The fact is that the Bush-Cheney years, even though Scott Brown's not Bush or Cheney, he supported them wholeheartedly. Those were his policies, his programs, his people, his philosophy that were put in place. And every step of the way, it defines the difference between a Martha Coakley and a Scott Brown. The Bush-Cheney years brought us a $2.1 trillion war in Iraq. It brought us a Wall Street that was run amok with hedge fund abuses. It brought us the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It brought us jobs disappearing each month by the hundreds of thousands. It brought us record bankruptcies, home foreclosures. It brought us millions of Americans without health insurance, global warming dismissed as a hoax, and record deficits piling up and piling up. Those were tough years for the country and tough years for Massachusetts. You know, we lost something. I think we had about 114,000 jobs gone from the Merrimack Valley down to the South Coast and Boston. And the number of citizens out of work in our state tripled from about 94,000 to 252,000. The number of people who lost their homes to foreclosure skyrocketed 20-fold, so that we have a total of almost 100,000 people lost their homes. And what's interesting and important is Martha Copley and Scott Brown saw those years very, very differently. Martha Copley got fed up and angry and fought back the way I like to think Democrats do fight back. Martha Copley stood up to the big dig contractors who were hurting people and robbing taxpayers, literally. And she got tough, and she brought settlements of almost $500 million back to the taxpayers of this state. Martha Coakley got mad at the wizards of Wall Street who brought us that foreclosure sale, and she got $60 million out of Goldman Sachs for subprime mortgage abuses. For Martha Coakley, it was a time to stand up and be counted. For Scott Brown, the Bush years just seemed like a great big blank in history. A total disconnect with what was happening to the citizens of Massachusetts and the people of our country. It was silent Scott, and support them at any cost, Scott. It was Scott during those Bush years where we were fighting to keep Social Security from privatized. He was silent. It was silent Scott, who can't point to one single thing that he said with respect to the war in Iraq. It is nothing said about George Bush's reckless deficits or spending. Now he wants to talk about spending. While his party ran Washington, and he did nothing, and he said nothing, when George Bush tried to privatize Social Security, and Ted Kennedy and I had to stand up with other Democrats and save it, Scott Brown was involved. For 8 years, he was George Bush's yes man, and now he wants to go to Washington and become Mitch McConnell's no man. That's right. And we're not going